Europe is well placed to take on the challenge of balancing against Russian power. Russia's a declining power. It's dangerous, but it's a declining power. The United States has never had a peer competitor quite like China. But I think anyone who is hoping or wishing that the Trump administration, comes to an end and maybe the Democratic Party takes over and we're going to have a return to sort of Biden-era policies and a Biden-era approach to the Transatlantic alliance is not recognizing the reality here in DC. At the same time that Netanyahu came to the United States and he sold Donald Trump on a story about this war and how it would be quick and decisive and the regime was vulnerable. But Donald Trump made an independent decision. And the reality is we can't underwrite security in Europe, the Middle East, and all of these places if we're going to try to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. The United States has always had an attitude of a sphere of influence is good for me, not for you, one for me, not for you. And so I think this idea of civilization and that it sees the world through that civilizational lens is one that's really important to understand about this administration because it's sometimes seen as not ideological. And the reality is that this is a very ideological administration. It's just a different ideology. There is something of a bipartisan consensus here in Washington, D.C., that European allies need to do significantly more. I have long thought that a stronger Europe, a militarily stronger Europe, is in the interest of the United States.
Welcome back to Geopolitics Studio. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Kelly Grieco. Dr. Grieco is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center with a program reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy. And today we are going to talk about U.S.-Iran war, U.S. Grand Strategy, and the current foreign policy of the U.S. administration. Dr. Grieco, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great honor having you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Let me start with a big picture question about the most pressing issue nowadays, which is the U.S.-Iran war. So how do you read the war at this point? Where do you think the war is heading? And also what are the main implications or the broader implications of the war for the U.S. Grand Strategy? Regionally in the Middle East, but also globally, if we take into consideration everything, US-China rivalry, etc.
Great. Well, excellent question to begin. And of course, we're talking this morning when the United States, during the ceasefire now, struck southern Iran. The news I woke up to, the report, they're saying it was self-defense. The report that Iran had was using or about to use vessels to insert some more mines into the strait, and the United States struck those vessels and also some missile sites in the south, which is not what we want to be hearing in the news. I think it captures, though, what your question is asking, which is where are we heading? And it's one of two directions. It looks like we're headed to either some type of agreement. I think in the next few days. That's the administration has been saying that it's very close. The Iranians have signaled that that's probably true as well. But I fear that this latest use of force could end up unraveling any progress that's been made. So I think this is a dangerous moment. And if we're not able to get an agreement, it looks like the president is inclined to return to force. Still believing in some way that if he uses more force, it will cause the Iranians to concede to his negotiating position, although I don't think that will actually work.
Thank you very much. I also want to ask about the dynamics between the United States and Israel, especially in terms of recent developments. We have been interviewing different people, and they have quite different opinions about it. Some say that Israel just presents the U.S. military arm in the region, but there are also opinions that Israel is actually the mastermind behind U.S. Middle East policies, and recently there have been also tensions. I also saw your retweet on X about asymmetric burden sharing when it comes to using the interceptors and other defensive weapons and some tensions between the United States and Israel. So, could you guide us through this dynamic and what is the influence of each actor here?
Yeah, so I think this has been one of the more controversial policy points here in DC. Has certainly been the role of Israel, and people take different positions on this. I'll just say that personally, I'm skeptical of the notion that Israel is somehow, a puppet master pulling strings, and that I find that narrative, frankly, anti-Semitic. So it's not one I subscribe to. I think Israel, like any other U.S. ally partner, is pursuing its own interests, and in places those have aligned with the United States interest. It's clear that at the same time that Netanyahu came to the United States and he sold Donald Trump on a story about this war and how it would be quick and decisive and the regime was vulnerable, but Donald Trump made an independent decision to join that war, to participate in it, and I think that is important to acknowledge. And anytime the United States is fighting with allies, fighting alongside allies and partners, the United States, its allies, its partners, all have their own interests. And at that moment, the decision to come to war is because those interests were seen to align. I think what we are seeing, though, over the course of the war is that those interests are starting to diverge more and more. It's clear that Donald Trump's top priority now is to try to get an agreement to end this war, and it's not as clear that the Israeli government as interested in that kind of agreement. And so I think you can start to see some tensions there, particularly as Israel takes certain actions in Lebanon, which again have the potential to undermine some kind of agreement. And so I think we're seeing sort of some of these inevitable tensions around interest.
Thank you so much. I also have one question about Iran specifically. So there have been lots of explanations and arguments why Iran has been so resilient, why it withstood all the attacks from, I don't know, forward defense, decentralized structures, etc., etc. So my question goes in different direction. Do you think Iran is a kind of unique case or special case, or this is how the warfare is going to look like in the future? That weaker sides will use cheap technologies such as drones and other stuff to somehow make the military field even and withstand the attacks by great powers.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and this is one that many of us are really thinking about that are do defense policy, trying to understand what the future of warfare will look like. I would say a couple things. I would say that what we're seeing with Iran and its ability to use, relatively low-cost missiles and drones, sea mines, fast attack boats, things like that are relatively cheap to, significant operational and strategic effect. I don't think that's about to go away. I think what we're seeing is a democratization of technology. And so many of the technologies today that are driving warfare forward or changing the character of war are things that are not exclusively for military use, like, say, stealth or nuclear weapons, but are really coming out of the commercial sector that are driving these trends forward. So thinking about microelectronics, drones, certainly robotics, artificial intelligence, which means that because these are things that are dual use, that they are quickly spreading. And they're much more accessible, and the changes can spread very quickly and are accessible to many actors and fast. And so that's something that is just a new reality about where warfare is heading. At the same time, I think it's important to emphasize, though, that there is still a place for these sort of higher end, high-end military platforms, but that the balance needs to change dramatically when we look at, like, the United States, for example, and how it's built its military, which is around a smaller number, expensive, exquisite systems. If it's going to increasingly face this world of cheap precision mass, it's going to need to rebalance the kinds of systems it has, its munitions depth, things like that, to be able to compete more effectively against that kind of threat.
And do you think, would you say it is happening in not just in the United States, but also among Western nations or great powers? Do they adapt to it?
The United States talks a lot about adapting to it, but when I look at budgets, I don't see it as much. The defense budget in some ways is where the real strategy is. I would say to this administration's credit, it has certainly placed an emphasis on two things. One, on munitions. And trying to increase U.S. Inventories around munitions that we desperately need, particularly things like missile defense, interceptors. The Lucas was essentially a Shahed knockoff Shahed drone one-way attack drone that we built, a replica of the Shahed. Those are things that are moving in the right direction. And then the other piece I'll just say is that this administration has leaned into the idea of increasing the use of drones. And so there are initiatives certainly in that direction. But when you look at the overall defense budget, it's it's relatively a small fraction of the defense budget overall. And so if you look at the U.S. Air Force, for example, where is it spending its money? It's spending its money on sixth-generation fighters and bombers, not these sort of new technologies.
Okay, thank you. I have also one question about U.S. grand strategy. I listened to another interview of you, said this administration, it replaced one unsustainable grand vision of liberal internationalism by what you termed civilizational nationalism, which in your opinion is also not very sustainable. And the ambition remained the same. So could you unpack this more and how this differs from previous U.S. administrations? What is new here?
Sure. So, I would say a couple of things. There is something clearly different about the Trump administration, certainly in its tone, the kind of language it uses, particularly with allies, especially European allies, in this America First language. But when we look at the substance of the policy, there's a lot of more continuity than people like to acknowledge between this administration and past ones. And so when we look at the basic idea, the administration did, I thought, a really nice job in its national security strategy of diagnosing the problems of U.S. foreign policy over the last 30 years about how it was overly ambitious. We had these problems of matching means and ends. We ended up in these endless wars in the Middle East that did not ultimately serve U.S. interests. And then it's like it got the diagnosis right, and then it completely failed in coming up with the alternative solution. It's as though it didn't listen to its own diagnosis or recognize that it needed to listen to its diagnosis. And so it thinks that, it's replacing, nation building, it's pursuing America first. But if you look at the documents themselves, they're all still really about primacy. There's a laundry list of the things it lists that it wants to remain the number one in, military, technology, there's a constant list of sort of the number one things that the United States is to remain number one. And that's really a definition of primacy. What I think it disagrees with past administrations is about how to do that. It thinks it has a better idea about how to remain number one and then what to do with that. And it's really a notion of a couple of things. One, by correcting trade imbalances will help to cover some of this means-ends gap. And also that allies have taken advantage of the United States. And that if there's more equitable burden sharing, burden shifting in some cases, then it will, again, allow it to close this means-ends gap. But it's worth noting that its concept, it seems, of allies in this case, if you are burden sharing and burden shifting, then allies are going to understandably expect to have more voice and may have more strategic independence. I don't think it's interested in either of those. It wants allies to do more, but not necessarily to have more independence from the United States. So this is not very realistic. And then I think that the biggest thing that I think is different about this administration is that, yes, it wants primacy, but what it wants to do with it is different than in the past. In the past, administrations saw it as primacy in order to spread liberal values, meaning democracy and human rights and freedom of the press, these kinds of values. This administration is not interested in that. In fact, it sees that as part of the failure of past administrations. But what was most, I think, striking and frankly to me shocking was the civilizational language in the national security strategy, where it talks about the civilizational erasure of Europe. And this is really ambitious language that it talks about. It sees a common civilization with Europe, and that it's, Europe essentially is not living up to that civilizational lineage, and talks about intervening potentially, in European domestic politics. That's highly interventionist. It's just a different type of interventionism. And so I think this idea of civilization, and that it sees the world through that civilizational lens, is one that's really important to understand about this administration, because it's sometimes seen as not ideological. And the reality is that this is a very ideological administration. It's just a different ideology.
Okay, this is interesting. I also want to ask about Europe. And so what you said about Europe, about NATO as well. And now in Germany, there is a feeling that US is not very reliable anymore, and they are rearming at a very fast pace. So they even declared that they want to become Europe's strongest conventional military by 2039. It's a odd day to pick, but still. And also some other countries are doing the same. So, and as you suggested, if Europe becomes an independent military power, okay, this will be on the one hand good for the United States to so that Europe can finally take care of its own security and balance against Russia and other threats. But at the same time, they will become independent from United States. They will buy less from United States probably. Now the Rheinmetall is becoming a new national champion in Germany. And my question is this in long-term interest of United States for Europe to emerge, if it emerges, as an independent military and self-sufficient military power?
I have long thought that a stronger Europe, a militarily stronger Europe, is in the interest of the United States. The reality is that the global balance of power, the distribution of power, is shifting, and it's shifting more towards the Indo-Pacific. And the United States has never had a peer competitor quite like China. The past peer challengers have had is about an economy about 2/3 the size of the United States, and China now is roughly about the same size economy as the United States. So this is a very different kind of challenge for the United States. And the reality is we can't underwrite security in Europe, the Middle East, and all of these places if we're going to try to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. So I think Europe is well placed to take on the challenge of balancing against Russian power. Russia's a declining power. It's dangerous, but it's a declining power. And so I think this is good for the United States. But I just think there's two things here to emphasize. One is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the United States completely withdraws from Europe. That could be a decision that's made, but it doesn't have to necessarily be that way. It does mean that we need to rebalance roles within it, as Europe is building up its own capacity and is going to become the natural leader then of NATO, and that should be reflected in positions like Supreme Allied Commander, things like that. We may need to think about how these positions are allocated. I think that's only fair. There can still be a role for the United States, particularly some niche capabilities, for example, perhaps in the maritime sphere. But I also think we need to be realistic, too, that as Europe becomes stronger, it's going to have more potential to be strategically independent. I'm not as concerned as some other people in DC about this, because I think that US and European interests are largely aligned. Are largely aligned. And so, yes, will there be disagreements at time? Yes, that's the reality. But I think on major issues of the day, particularly with respect to China, that US interests, particularly on economic issues, are going to be largely aligned with Europe. And so I'm not as concerned about that as many others. And I think that overall, what we're gaining in a stronger Europe outweighs, the costs in terms of any kind of leverage we would have on Europe. And you also brought up the issue of US companies. Well, US defense companies can't keep up with orders right now as it is. In fact, it's actually, I think, a value for the United States if we have a robust European defense industry. For US national interests, it's certainly good. Maybe it's not as good for American defense companies, but, I'm concerned more with the U.S. national interest, not, a more narrow commercial interest.
Okay, thanks very much. And so to extend this question, so you also mentioned this civilizational or ideological component of U.S. current strategy. So what do you think, what is the world that the current U.S. administration envisages now in terms of global order? So obviously it will not be rules-based order anymore. Is it something like the world divided in spheres of influence, or where the U.S. still has primacy, but also the different poles of power take care of their neighborhoods, or what kind of world is it where the U.S. administration would like to live?
I think this is it's not quite as clear. It's clear that the United States, or at least the Trump administration, has some notion of spheres of influence. Certainly in the Western Hemisphere, though, I think it's worth noting that this is not unique to the Trump administration. In some sense, the United States has always had an attitude of a sphere of influence is good for me, not for you. One for me, not for you. But I think the notion so I think they recognize something around spheres. But I think this notion that they're going to subscribe to a broad sort of conception of a Russian or a Chinese sphere of influence is not necessarily the case. I don't think the administration has a very clear idea of what the new order is, in part because it's emerging. I think they have a clear idea of what they don't like, and they've been destroying many of the things that they don't like. Other than this idea of a G2, with China and some notion of, the two countries speaking to one another, coordinating on some policy issues, they haven't really articulated clearly what replaces it. And again, I think this administration is focused more on trying to be unencumbered by what they see as a past that no longer serves U.S. interests, but they haven't clearly articulated what replaces it.
Okay, and one of the last questions. I guess this is more about the guesswork, but the current U.S. foreign policy as it is now, how much is it specifically linked to this current administration? And if we have, for instance, the power change in U.S., how much continuity will we have even if other administration comes to power?
Yeah, so I would say, again, I think some of the tone potentially could change in terms of, the language we're using to talk about these issues, particularly the language with allies and partners. But I think anyone who is hoping or wishing that the Trump administration, comes to an end and maybe the Democratic Party takes over and we're going to have a return to sort of Biden-era policies and a Biden-era approach to the Transatlantic alliance is not recognizing the reality here in D.C. I don't think that's about to happen. We have to recognize there are structural changes happening in the world in terms of how power is redistributing. And I would just note that there is something of a bipartisan consensus here in Washington, D.C., that European allies need to do significantly more, and that U.S. priorities lay more in the Indo-Pacific than they do in Europe. And so I think any future administration that we see coming in is going to be developing policies that are aligned with that basic understanding, even if the tone may be quite different, hopefully not as bullying as the current administration. And I'll just note, we've seen these kind of tone differences before when the policies don't really change. If you think about George W. Bush to Obama, many people felt like, it's a new administration, it's very different policies. But the reality was the policies were not all that different between those administrations. The tone was very different. And so that's sort of what I would think about moving forward, is probably something more in that order.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Grieco. It was a great honor having you and very interesting discussion. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.